In a packed New York studio, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett faced off against Fox News titan Sean Hannity over a question America's been too afraid to ask. When the media becomes the weapon, who protects the truth? Hannity tried to humiliate her, armed with decades of dominance and millions of viewers. But within 7 blistering minutes, Jasmine flipped the script with sworn testimony, leaked files, and a name he never expected to hear again. The crowd turned, the camera froze, and for the first time in 23 years, Hannity had no words. If power lies in who holds the microphone, what happens when it's ripped away? On live television. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom pulsed with static tension. Under the towering banner, National Media Summit, media, judge or servant, a half-moon of leather chairs awaited the night's combatants. Cameras rotated like sentries, ready to broadcast every twitch. Seated dead center was Sean Hannity, sharp in a tailored Navy suit, posture loose but commanding. He wasn't just a television personality. He was the voice of conservative America, a media juggernaut who'd spent decades shaping public opinion with repetition, outrage, and ironclad certainty. He wore the smug calm of a man who believed the room answered to him. His smile wasn't polite. It was a smirk forged from decades of power without pushback. He didn't prepare, he presided. This was his arena, until the doors opened. Jasmine Crockett entered, not like a guest, but like a verdict. Dressed in black, like a silhouette of rebellion, she moved without pause or preamble. Her eyes scanned the room, not to admire, but to measure. The moderator cleared his throat, voice cracking slightly as he announced, "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising voice of reform." She nodded once, cool and razor-sharp. Across the stage, Hannity's eyes met hers, and in that instant, the air itself changed. One side smoldered with experience turned arrogance, the other with fire honed by injustice. Their silence screamed louder than any headline. They didn't blink, they didn't smile, they calculated. Hannity tapped his notes with theatrical ease. Jasmine opened a folder, thin, precise, loaded. No need for flair. She didn't come to entertain. She came to cut. This wasn't media analysis. It was war, dressed in suits and televised for America to witness. And for the first time in years, Sean Hannity might have realized he wasn't the one holding the knife. The air had barely settled from the weight of their silence when Hannity struck. Not with curiosity, not with a question, but with a performance so sharp it sliced the room in half. He leaned forward with that signature blend of arrogance and ease, his voice smooth, familiar, disarming to those who didn't know what lay beneath. "Let me begin," he said, smiling just enough to mock, "by welcoming Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a woman who, not too long ago, said Fox News should be shut down because apparently freedom of the press ends when the headlines don't flatter her." The moment landed like a slap disguised as a handshake. Chuckles rose from the audience, dry at first, then swelling into amused applause. Hannity didn't blink. He soaked in the noise like stage light. He wasn't introducing her. He was warning them, framing her not as a guest but a threat, a danger dressed in authority. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked through her, past her, as if the seat she occupied was already empty in his mind. Then came the paper. Clean, crisp, underlined quotes printed in bold. "Let's see what she's gifted us with over the years," he said, lifting the sheet with the precision of a magician about to pull a trick from thin air. Here's one. "Mainstream media reinforces systemic racism with every headline it chooses not to print." He looked up, feigned a shocked eyebrow. "Wow, that's not divisive at all." The crowd laughed. He turned to another. "If you're comfortable with the truth, you haven't met it yet." Another pause, another smirk. "And this one's my favorite," he added, holding the page higher as if offering evidence in court. "Some media platforms profit more from lies than facts because fear sells better than truth." Then with mock concern layered in sarcasm, he added, "Apparently, this is how Congresswoman Crockett defines journalism." He lowered the page slowly and stared directly into the camera, his voice growing heavier, more deliberate. "What we have here, ladies and gentlemen," he said, scanning the audience for nods, "is not a critic of media bias. This is someone who fundamentally despises the freedom of the press when it disagrees with her worldview. He let the words hang in the air like smoke from a burning flag. This isn't about accountability. This is about control, about silencing dissent, about replacing journalism with ideology. The applause that followed wasn't enthusiastic. It was triumphant. It was the sound of people being told exactly what they wanted to hear. But this wasn't debate. This was demolition. He wasn't rebutting arguments. He was disfiguring them, ripping them from context like weeds in a garden he claimed was pure. He took complex, urgent critiques, ones born from Jasmine's lived experience, navigating injustice, media exclusion, and systemic erasure, and twisted them into slogans. He reframed her as an enemy of the First Amendment, a threat to objectivity, a woman who supposedly didn't just mistrust the media, but wanted to dismantle it entirely. And all the while, Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her hands were folded calmly on the folder in her lap, her breath steady, her posture unbroken. The camera zoomed in, hoping for a flash of emotion, rage, shame, even a twitch of discomfort. But she gave them nothing, because this wasn't new. This was choreography she'd seen before. Then came the final blow. Hannity adjusted his mic, looked out into the sea of smirks, and dropped the line with surgical timing. Maybe before Congresswoman Crockett starts preaching about media integrity, she should take a moment to learn how journalism actually works. Applause erupted, full-bodied and unfiltered. It wasn't about ideas. It was about dominance, the power of familiarity, of voice, of comfort, the comfort of watching a woman of color be patronized under lights that called it discourse, the comfort of being told again that the old system was still in charge. But Jasmine sat, stone still, not frozen, coiled. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't broken. She was choosing, waiting, timing her strike not for volume, but for precision. And behind that calm was something far more dangerous than anger. Clarity, because Hannity had made one mistake. He thought she came to argue. She had come to expose. But Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't match volume with volume or sarcasm with outrage. She moved like someone who had carried this moment in her pocket for years, waiting not for permission, but for precision. Her hand moved quietly, deliberately to the microphone switch. A soft click broke the tension like a whisper before a gunshot. She didn't look to the audience, didn't glance at the moderator. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the folder before her, the same one she had kept closed while enduring the volleys of mockery and distortion. With calm fingers, she pulled a single page free, its corners already creased from use, its margin marked with highlighter and conviction. Her voice, when it came, was controlled, low enough to force people to lean in, sharp enough to slice through the fog of performance. Exhibit 247, she said, from the Dominion Voting Systems versus Fox News case, sworn deposition, Mr. Hannity, December 2020. No inflection, just truth, laid bare. I did not believe it for 1 second. She looked up, straight at him. That was your statement, under oath. The room froze. You could hear shoes shift, papers settle, even the whirring of a nearby camera motor. But Hannity didn't move. Not yet. Jasmine continued, voice still even, but gaining gravity. You said that in a closed deposition, not on your show, not to your audience, not to the people who tuned in every night looking for clarity and instead got fed a lie, one you never even believed. Her words weren't theatrical. They were prosecutorial. She wasn't asking a question. She was building a case against him, against the brand, against the silence that protected it. Then she paused, intentionally, surgically. So tell me, Mr. Hannity, she said, each word placed like a nail driven into oak. Do you believe in freedom of speech, or do you believe in the freedom to defraud the public, so long as the ratings are good enough to justify it? No applause, no coughing, no chair creaked. The entire ballroom sat trapped in that single shattering question. Hannity shifted at last. He leaned back in his chair, arms folding across his chest in that familiar posture of manufactured composure. But something had changed. His body said control. His eyes did not. They flicked, left, right, up at the lights, searching, calculating, avoiding. The smirk remained, but its confidence had drained. In its place was the hollow performance of a man who suddenly realized the script was no longer his. Jasmine didn't press the silence. She let it speak. Because in that stillness, longer than anyone expected, louder than any applause, was the one thing Sean Hannity had never allowed into his broadcasts: accountability. And in that moment, with every eye on him and every microphone live, he had no line, no rescue, no applause cue, just the sound of his own words, read back to him by the very woman he tried to silence. The truth about the Dominion lawsuit had landed like a tremor, but Jasmine knew that beneath every crack in the surface, there was something deeper waiting to be exposed. And this time, it wasn't about ratings. It was about dignity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move dramatically. She simply picked up a small remote resting beside her notes and pressed it. The massive LED screen behind the stage flickered, then shifted. No graphics, no headlines, just a single photo, plain, unfiltered, human. The face of Caree appeared in silence. Her expression was neutral, almost quiet, but the moment it filled the screen, the room changed. Some recognized her immediately. Others squinted, trying to remember where they'd seen that name before. And a few, those who knew exactly who she was, looked down. Jasmine didn't look back at the image. She didn't need to. Her voice, now lower but unmistakably clear, carried across the room with the weight of someone who had waited long enough. "This is Caree," she said evenly. "A journalist, a mother, a woman who once sat in the same makeup chairs, under the same studio lights, and beside the same anchor who now sits across from me." She let that sit for half a second, then quietly. She was humiliated in front of colleagues. She was silenced in court, and she was erased from this industry the moment she spoke up. The screen didn't blink. Neither did Jasmine. In her formal complaint to federal court, she continued, opening a single sheet from her folder, Ms. Arroyo described an incident during a live taping of Mr. Hannity's show. He held up a $100 bill on set in front of the production crew and offered it as a reward to any man in the room willing to take her out to dinner that night. Her tone was even, but the words hit like slow, deliberate strikes. Let me be clear. That wasn't a joke. That was a challenge. One wrapped in power, one designed to ridicule her, one that turned a colleague into a bet. Murmurs rippled across the room. Jasmine didn't acknowledge them. Her focus remained razor sharp. She was called too sensitive, told to move on. Lawyers called it a misunderstanding. But what do you call it when a woman is turned into a prize in her own workplace? She asked, not rhetorically, but quietly, sincerely. What do you call it when laughter becomes a weapon and no one has the courage to say it out loud? Then she turned, slowly, deliberately. For the first time, she looked directly at Sean Hannity. You thought it was funny, but I promise you, federal law does not. The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was judgment. And like all men who mistake applause for absolution, Hannity responded not with truth, but with volume. Sean Hannity snapped forward in his chair, fury pulsing through every word. His voice, once polished and performative, now cracked with raw indignation. This is outrageous, he bellowed, eyes flashing toward the audience, then the cameras as if daring them to agree. This is slander, on national television. You're making things up. His face flushed crimson, jaw clenched so tight it looked locked. He pounded his palm once against the desk, not a gesture of control, but of a man unraveling. You're twisting words, dragging out accusations that don't belong in this forum. This isn't justice. It's a hit job. His eyes darted to the moderator, to the producers, to anyone who might jump in and stop the freefall. But no one moved. No teleprompter could save him now. What stood before the room wasn't a media legend defending truth. It was a man cornered by it. Across the table, Jasmine didn't react with triumph or glee. She didn't even blink. She turned to him slowly, deliberately, like a surgeon preparing the next incision. Her expression didn't gloat, it clarified. Her voice came low, even, the kind of calm that doesn't ask permission. I am a lawyer, Mr. Hannity. she said, every word sharp and distinct. And you are, as of this moment, a potential defendant. The room stilled again, not because she was loud, but because she was right. That's not my opinion. That's not theater. That's the legal distinction between someone who builds arguments and someone who breaks them under oath. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. Her authority wasn't borrowed from viewership. It came from consequence. The audience, once so quick to laugh with Hannity, now watched him with something else in their eyes. Not anger, not even pity. It was realization that for the first time in years, the man who framed narratives was now trapped inside one. And Jasmine, she didn't come to debate. She came to remind him that the law doesn't need ratings, it only needs truth. The room was still reeling from the force of Jasmine's calm precision. But Hannity, bruised but unbowed, wasn't finished. For men like him, losing ground was never an end, only a signal to fight dirtier. He shifted forward in his chair, as if reassembling his persona brick by brick. The tremor in his pride hadn't disappeared. It had just been dressed up again in sarcasm and cynicism. "Let's not pretend this is about truth," he said, his voice regaining its manufactured steadiness. "This is theater. This is emotion masquerading as substance. What you're doing isn't journalism, Congresswoman. It's spectacle. You're not here to inform. You're here to inflame." His gaze swept across the audience, looking for the nods that once came so easily. "You're a product of a political culture obsessed with outrage. Loud voices, empty arguments, no solutions. All feeling, no facts. And the only thing more dangerous than bad policy is emotional politics parading around as justice." He leaned back slightly, as if he'd regained the upper hand, a familiar smirk threatening to return to his lips. But Jasmine didn't allow it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even shift in her seat. She waited until every syllable of his last line had settled into the silence like dust. And then she moved, not physically, but with words, clean and quiet, that cut deeper than a scream ever could. If calling out the dehumanization of women, exposing a system that protects lies, and demanding accountability is what you call emotional politics, she said, then maybe the problem isn't with my passion. Her voice was steady, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Maybe the problem is that your sense of morality never made it past the soundstage? The line didn't land like a punch. It landed like a verdict. The room froze, not just in silence, but in realization. This wasn't rebuttal. This was reflection. Because what she said wasn't just about him. It was about every camera that looked the other way, every producer who trimmed truth to fit a narrative, every audience that clapped louder for style than substance. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. It tightened. "I wasn't sent here to make people comfortable. I wasn't elected to play nice with power. I'm here to remind people that justice doesn't arrive in a teleprompter, and truth doesn't need your permission to speak." And in that moment, the room that once belonged to Hannity no longer recognized him as its master. It had found a new voice, one that didn't perform, one that didn't retreat, one that, against every expectation, refused to fold in the face of manufactured authority. Jasmine had already shaken the room with truth, but what came next wasn't just revelation, it was confirmation. Cold, documented, and undeniable. She raised her hand, not to interrupt, not to dramatize, but to command the room's attention with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. The screen behind her flickered once more, replacing the black silence with a stark white label across the top. Deposition video. Melissa Grant, former senior segment editor, Fox News. There was no music, no graphics, just a woman in a gray blazer seated at a legal table, hands clasped, eyes steady, and a timestamp in the bottom corner. The kind of footage reserved for courtrooms, not conference stages. Jasmine didn't speak. She stepped back, allowing the video to speak for itself. Melissa Grant's voice filled the room, calm and clinical. "Yes," she said, "I was instructed directly by Mr. Hannity to assemble segments using reactions that were pre-written or recorded from unrelated events. Often we would prepare graphics and comment clips for social media fallout before the segment even aired." She blinked once, then continued, emotionless. "He said it was important to get ahead of the story. But we weren't chasing facts. We were producing emotion, anticipating public reaction, and then feeding it back to the audience like it was spontaneous. The room was frozen. No one shifted. No one coughed. The silence wasn't respectful. It was paralyzed. Melissa's voice didn't waver. It was called building the wave. He believed if we framed it strong enough, loud enough, and fast enough, the response would follow, and that response would justify the frame. It was a loop, not reporting. Reinforcement. The video cut after that, clean and simple. No outro. Jasmine stepped forward again, eyes sweeping across the audience. Her tone even, her posture unshaken. That wasn't a critic. That wasn't an activist. That was one of his producers, under oath. She didn't have to raise her voice. Each word was weighed, measured, deliberate. While he accused me of bringing emotion to the table, his own newsroom was manufacturing it like a product, designing public outrage, controlling headlines before they even existed. She paused just long enough to let the truth sting. This is not freedom of speech. This is emotional laundering, wrapping fiction in just enough reality to sell it as fact. And then she said what no one else had the nerve to say in that room before her. This wasn't journalism. It was psychological manipulation in a tailored suit. And the public trusted it because they never got to see what we just did. She stepped back. The screen behind her was dark again. But now it wasn't silence that filled the space. It was consequence. Real, heavy, and finally, visible. The screen went black, but the silence it left behind wasn't relief. It was reckoning. What had started as a debate was now something else entirely. And for the first time all night, the crowd didn't know how to feel. The atmosphere in the room had changed so completely, it was almost a different space. Just 30 minutes earlier, the audience had been leaning back in their chairs, smirking, clapping along to Hannity's taunts with the smug ease of those watching a show they thought they understood. But now, they leaned forward, eyes narrowed, jaws tight. People who had laughed were no longer sure where the line between entertainment and exposure had fallen. The air, once laced with Fox-flavored confidence, now hummed with discomfort. It wasn't just Jasmine's words, it was the proof, the sworn testimony, the footage, the still image of Kathy Aru's face hanging in their memory like a mirror they hadn't asked for. A woman in the third row dropped her arms from a defensive cross and rested her elbows on her knees. A man near the side stage tapped his phone screen but didn't unlock it, his thumb just hovering, as if afraid of what he'd miss. On stage, a production assistant leaned over to whisper something urgent to the floor director. The director, after a brief pause, gave a silent, universal signal. Cut the segment. Wrap it now. Move. The lights were still on. The cameras were still rolling. But behind the scenes, panic had begun to circulate like a sudden virus in a sealed room. Jasmine saw the movement, the hand gestures, the flashing red on the teleprompter indicating a countdown. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She stepped forward, and then she said it. "If you cut my microphone," she began, her voice even, clear, and louder than any control room could mute. "I still have the law. I still have the internet. I still have people watching and listening, not because they're told to, but because they choose to." The room didn't gasp. It didn't breathe. Jasmine glanced at the back cameras, not the front, not the one assigned to catch her at a flattering angle, but the one behind the audience, the one that would broadcast their reaction, not just her words. "And unlike what we've just seen tonight," she continued, "truth doesn't need a broadcast license. It doesn't need a producer's approval. It only needs one thing, the courage to say it out loud, even when every light in the room is trying to turn off." The stage manager motioned again. The screen behind her now flickered with the show's outro logo, soft music starting to fade in. Pre-programmed, pre-scheduled, pre-authorized. She took one final step closer to the edge of the stage. "And today," Jasmine said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, "truth will not be cut off." She didn't shout it. She delivered it like a judge reading a sentence. Calm, cold, final. There was no applause. There was something better. Stillness. The kind of stillness that follows a courtroom verdict. The kind that follows the moment after a man realizes the script he's memorized his entire life no longer applies. And then all eyes turned to Hannity. He hadn't moved since the video played, since the testimony, since Jasmine turned his old set of tools, sarcasm, certainty, smirks, into useless metal at his feet. His body was stiff in his chair, his arms crossed more tightly than before. But it wasn't confidence, it was containment. His mouth parted once like he might say something, but nothing came, not even a scoff. His silence wasn't gracious, it was stunned. This was the man who never ran out of words, who could pivot through scandal, twist outrage into applause, and flip any confrontation into a ratings boost. But tonight, there was no bounce, no punchline, no pivot. Only the realization that this wasn't a TV segment. It was a moment, and it didn't belong to him. For the first time in his career, Sean Hannity was not narrating the room. He was in it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't bow. She simply turned her microphone off herself, gently. She didn't wait to be silenced. She chose silence, because the point had already been made, and made thoroughly. Not just with emotion, but with law. Not just with anger, but with evidence. Not just with words, but with something deeper. The kind of clarity that lives longer than sound bites. She took one step back, her face composed, her spine straight, her presence unshaken. And the man who'd called her emotional, performative, irrational, sat in a silence crafted by no one but himself. He was the only one who couldn't fill the room anymore, because she already had. The stage lights dimmed, and the audience filed out in stunned silence. But what Jasmine had started inside that ballroom didn't end when the cameras cut. It had only just begun. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off stage and into the hallway, her closing line had already begun to echo far beyond the conference walls. A producer's smartphone lit up with hundreds of notifications in a matter of seconds. The control room, once buzzing with scripted order, was now in complete chaos. Emails flooding in, phones ringing from New York to Los Angeles. Clips of her final words, "Truth doesn't need a broadcast license," began spreading across social media like wildfire. Within 15 minutes, edited videos hit Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Each cut sharper than the last, each caption bolder, angrier, louder. Jasmine destroys Hannity with facts. She spoke. He fell silent. When a lawyer becomes the truth. By the hour mark, hashtags surged into national trending territory. Crockett uncut, Fox exposed, and Truth Not ratings. Overnight, her moment had become a movement. Viewers who hadn't watched the summit were now watching on loop. Teachers were showing the clip in classrooms. Activists were quoting her in live streams. Even late-night hosts, usually too timid to touch Fox News directly, aired segments with the line, "She didn't debate him. She dismantled him." But what came next pushed it into history. CNN broke the headline just past 8 a.m. the next morning. Exclusive. Caree speaks out, backs Jasmine Crockett's allegations against Hannity. The screen flashed with an image of Caree, older now, sharper in the eyes, stronger in the shoulders. She wasn't behind a deposition table this time. She was on set, live, in studio. And when the anchor asked the first question, "Was what Jasmine Crockett said true?" she didn't blink. "Yes," Caree said. "All of it." She continued, clear, measured, unapologetic. That bounty offer happened exactly as Jasmine described. The culture at Fox was toxic, and I wasn't the only one treated that way. But I was the first to speak, and I paid a price for it. Jasmine didn't just tell the truth. She told mine, and gave it a place I was never allowed to reach. The national conversation. Screens across the country froze as millions watched Caree detail what had been buried. Emails ignored, witnesses silenced, internal HR memos rerouted to legal before they ever reached human eyes. "They didn't just try to erase me," she said. "They tried to erase what they did." By noon, Fox News was on lockdown. Inside the network's headquarters, panic had turned operational. Top executives were called into an emergency session. The meeting was off the record, windowless, and boiling with urgency. Phones were placed in Faraday pouches. Doors were secured. Someone had already printed the transcript of Kathy's interview. Someone else had red-circled key phrases: pattern of abuse, legal retaliation, deliberate silencing. A third executive pointed out what they had all begun to fear. It's not just her anymore. The entire media structure is watching. Then the inevitable question was raised, quietly, bitterly. Do we pull the plug? The room didn't answer right away. Sean Hannity's face, once the most profitable brand on their evening lineup, now sat at the center of a firestorm too big to spin. For years, they'd survived scandals with well-timed denials and shifting attention. But this was different. This wasn't just accusation. It was testimony. It was video. It was names. And worse, it was being believed. At 2:43 p.m., an internal memo was sent to the entire Fox executive team. All editorial programming connected to Hannity will be suspended pending review. Further decisions to follow. Immediate PR coordination required. Just like that, the most protected seat in cable news was no longer guaranteed. Outside, reporters crowded the front doors. Cameras clicked with every employee exiting the building. Protesters had begun gathering, some with signs quoting Jasmine word for word. If you cut my mic, I still have the law. Others carried Kathy's face, printed in black and white above the words, believe her. But amid the storm, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. She didn't post victory videos or dance to trending audios. She disappeared from public view for 24 hours. Because for Jasmine, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about consequence. The kind of consequence women like Kathy had never been granted. The kind that didn't end with applause, but with accountability. She knew the system wouldn't fall overnight. But for the first time, it had blinked. And she wasn't done. Not even close. But the shockwaves from Jasmine's confrontation didn't stop at headlines or hashtags. They cracked something deeper, something institutional. In newsrooms from Manhattan to Milwaukee, and in classrooms where tomorrow's journalists were still learning the ethics they'd soon have to abandon, something shifted. And for the first time in years, truth didn't feel like a slogan. It felt like a demand. Within 48 hours of the summit, dozens of resignation letters started appearing across social media. At first, they were brushed off by executives as isolated cases of professional immaturity. But by the third day, entire digital teams had walked out of 2 regional affiliates. A viral tweet from a 23-year-old producer at a mid-tier outlet read, "I joined journalism to fight for truth, not ratings. Jasmine reminded me what that looks like." Another post on Substack, written by a veteran who had covered 3 administrations, was more brutal. If my silence gave power to someone like Hannity, then Jasmine Crockett didn't just call him out, she called me out too. Each post struck like a drumbeat in a swelling rebellion, louder with every hour. By the weekend, Columbia Journalism School announced a full-day emergency colloquium. The banner on its official invite, now plastered across academic networks, bore one sentence in stark, block serif font. Who controls the narrative and who controls them? The event didn't feel academic. It felt like a tribunal. Inside Pulitzer Hall, cameras lined the walls. Ivy League deans sat shoulder to shoulder with undergraduates in hoodies. Even tenured professors looked uneasy, not because they feared disagreement, but because they knew they were no longer safe behind abstraction. The moderator opened not with a quote from Walter Cronkite or Murrow, but with a clip, unedited, of Jasmine's now infamous line. "Do you believe in freedom of speech, or just freedom to lie for ratings?" The room held its breath. When the lights came back on, no one moved for a full 5 seconds. A student from Yale stood up, voice steady. "We've spent years dissecting fake news in theory, but we just watched a sitting congresswoman cut through it in real time. That wasn't politics. That was journalism." A faculty member from NYU added quietly, "It used to be said that the media shapes reality. What happens when the truth shapes the media?" No one laughed. No one dismissed it. For the next 5 hours, testimonies poured in. A former CNN field producer recalled being told to wait for the right spin before airing footage. An ex-social editor from a major network described internal Slack channels designed to heat up outrage before primetime. But most striking were the voices of the students who had dreamed of reporting from war zones, covering crises and exposing fraud, now questioning whether the institutions they aspired to join still valued any of it. Back in Washington, Jasmine sat in her modest office, phone off, laptop closed, simply breathing in the silence that follows a storm. Her assistant entered quietly, carrying a thick bundle of printed letters and emails. Jasmine didn't reach for them at first. She just stared at the weight of them, like they carried something she wasn't yet ready to feel. Then she took one from the middle, a single handwritten line. "You didn't just win an argument, you changed the rules of the game." The next was from a journalism major in Texas. "Every professor here tells us to stay neutral, but you showed us that truth is not neutral, and we don't have to be either." One envelope, unusually thick, had a note clipped to the front, shared by 42 student editors across the country. Inside was a signed petition nominating Jasmine for the Independent Media Ethics Award, an honor that had, until then, only gone to working journalists. The nomination letter read, "She is not a reporter, but she held the most powerful reporter in America to account, not with spin, with fact, not with fury, with truth, and she did it on his turf." Jasmine didn't cry. She rarely did. But she folded that letter with care, pressed it flat, and slid it between the pages of a worn legal binder labeled Truth and Reform. Then, for the first time in a long time, she leaned back in her chair, not with exhaustion, but with quiet purpose. Outside her door, the world was still spinning. Networks were still strategizing. Executives were still meeting behind closed doors. But somewhere, a freshman in Missouri turned down an internship at a Fox affiliate. Somewhere, a junior in New Jersey rewrote their senior thesis to include Jasmine's speech as a case study in journalistic integrity. Somewhere, a student newspaper replaced a scheduled op-ed with an editorial titled, "When Truth Walked in Wearing Black." This wasn't just fallout, it was formation. And in those rare, quiet moments when Jasmine sat alone, no cameras, no microphones, no need to perform, she knew something irreversible had happened. Not because she had destroyed a man's argument, but because she had reminded a generation what it looks like to fight back with facts, to cut through power not with volume, but with precision. For years, media had taught America how to forget. That night, Jasmine taught them how to remember, and the truth at last was no longer scared to speak. And while institutions hesitated, the independent voices rose. Like embers catching wind, the backlash ignited not through official channels, but through raw, unfiltered momentum. It began with a tweet from an anonymous journalist, captioned only, "What if we've been complicit?" Within hours, a private Slack group of investigative reporters, many of whom had long felt handcuffed by corporate media contracts, turned into a hive of quiet rebellion. They didn't wait for permission. They began digging. It wasn't a formal investigation, no press conference, no banner headline. Just a spreadsheet, a shared drive, and the grit of those who still believed journalism was supposed to serve the public, not manufacture its beliefs. They called it Project Frequency. Its mission was clear: track every time Sean Hannity had broadcast misinformation and document the aftermath. Within 3 days, the file held over 200 entries, complete with dates, video links, transcripts, and, more hauntingly, the real-world consequences that followed each lie. One entry showed a segment falsely linking a Muslim city council candidate to terrorist sympathies, airing just 72 hours before the man's family received death threats and had to flee their home. Another entry revealed a debunked story accusing a high school teacher of indoctrinating students with critical race theory. The segment ran in prime time. The teacher was doxxed the next morning. She lost her job. She moved to another state. No correction ever aired. But what chilled the team most weren't just the lies. It was the quiet trail of muted apologies that came after. They found buried legal filings, non-disclosure settlements inked in silence, apologies signed behind closed doors, reputations repaired with money but never with airtime. One memo uncovered in a civil complaint simply read, "Client requests on-air apology." Fox declined, offered private letter instead. They contacted the victims, teachers, pastors, election workers, parents of trans kids, falsely accused of grooming, of fraud, of anti-Americanism, people who'd never been famous until they became punching bags for a narrative. One by one, they agreed to speak, not for justice, but for reckoning. We weren't destroyed by fact, one woman said. We were erased by fiction. The team created an interactive archive, a single portal where anyone could search Hannity's broadcast by date, topic, and alleged misinformation. Within a week, it was trending on Reddit. Within 2, it crashed from traffic overload. The public wasn't just curious. They were starving for receipts, for evidence, for truth reclaimed from memory. And then came the hardest part, the internal whistleblowers. A former segment producer, using a voice modulator, shared how emotional velocity was prioritized over factual precision. They told us we needed 3 things per story: a villain, a symbol, and a trigger. The truth was optional. The formula was sacred. Another editor admitted they had been instructed to reframe raw footage to stoke anger, even if it meant removing context. We didn't lie, he said. We just told the truth sideways, which sometimes is worse. They compiled all of it, transcripts, emails, internal directives, into a single encrypted report called the Unspoken Broadcast. It didn't accuse Hannity of making mistakes. It accused him of perfecting them. Newsweek ran an op-ed, America's Most Trusted Liar. The Atlantic followed, The Ratings That Cost Us Reality. And on an independent podcast ranked #1 on Spotify that week, a former Fox contributor dropped the line that pierced the silence. Hannity didn't just poison the well, he made us thirsty for it. Across the country, civic groups demanded congressional hearings. Journalism schools revised curriculum. Media watchdogs expanded their archives. But in living rooms and kitchen tables, where most of Hannity's influence had festered, something more subtle happened. Viewers didn't just stop watching, they started questioning. They Googled, they rewatched, they asked their parents, "Did he ever tell you the whole story?" The scandal wasn't in the shouting, it was in the silence, in the corrections that never aired, in the faces never shown again after being used as punchlines, in the inboxes of producers who begged to issue retractions but were told, "We don't do U-turns, we double down." For Jasmine Crockett, the fallout wasn't about vindication, it was about validation. She hadn't just cut through a man, she had cut through an ecosystem, and now that ecosystem was bleeding. Somewhere in a small studio apartment in Des Moines, a journalism student stayed up till 3 a.m., compiling a personal database of media lies, not for class but for conscience. Somewhere in Georgia, a former veteran-turned-truck driver logged into the Project Frequency site, found a segment that once maligned him and whispered, "I knew it." And in every corner of the country, those who had been labeled overreacting, too sensitive, or emotional, began to feel something rare, seen. Not because Hannity was silent, but because they were no longer silent. It wasn't justice, but it was the beginning of something that looked like it. And this time, no one could cut to commercial. The walls of legacy media were crumbling, but Jasmine wasn't waiting for the dust to settle. As the echo of her confrontation with Hannity still ricocheted across the country, and major outlets debated whether to cover it or downplay it, she made a move they didn't expect. She didn't go back on air. She didn't accept any invitation from the same networks that once muted stories like hers. She didn't seek airtime. She seized it. At precisely 7 p.m. Eastern, Jasmine Crockett went live. Not on a studio set, but from her modest office lined with legal books and a glowing Black Lives Matter banner behind her desk. No makeup crew, no teleprompter, no executive producer whispering in her ear, just her voice, her truth, and a blinking red dot. And unlike any network she'd ever been on, she wasn't alone. The screen split within minutes, one face, then another, then another. They weren't politicians. They weren't celebrities. They were the collateral damage Hannity had left behind. She began with a breath, long, steady, deliberate. "Tonight," she said, "we're not responding to lies. We're reclaiming what those lies cost." The first speaker was a mother from Arizona, Emma Rivas. 2 years ago, Hannity ran a segment suggesting she helped traffic illegal immigrants across the border. The reality? She ran a volunteer aid station handing out bottled water to migrants abandoned by smugglers in the desert. After the segment aired, someone firebombed her supply shed. The police found her dog poisoned. Her kids still get called slurs at school. I wrote letters to Fox, Emma said, voice shaking. I asked them to correct it. All I got was silence. Next came Darius Lane, a Navy veteran who had spoken out at a city council meeting in Ohio about police reform. Hannity's show labeled him a BLM extremist and accused him of disrespecting American values. Darius lost his job. His VA counselor was warned he was unstable, and his younger brother, who hadn't even been involved, was jumped outside a grocery store. Freedom of speech? Darius asked the camera. That man weaponized it, against me, against truth. Jasmine let the silence hang. Her face didn't flinch. She wasn't just hosting, she was witnessing. The pain, the patterns, the predictable playbook of distortion and denial. It was all being laid bare not in headlines, but in the trembling voices of those who'd survived them. A young woman named Camille joined next. She had once worked as an intern for a local Democratic campaign in Florida. Her picture was pulled off a public Instagram post and used in a story accusing the campaign of hiring radicalized youth. Hannity's segment blurred nothing. Her name was said aloud. Online, the backlash came fast. Death threats, doxing, her family forced to move. She never went into politics again. He didn't just steal my safety, she said. He stole the future I thought I was building. The live stream grew. By the hour mark, over 2 million viewers had tuned in. Thousands more flooded the comments with stories of their own. Grandfathers misquoted, teachers misrepresented, neighbors maligned by headlines they never got to correct. And through it all, Jasmine didn't narrate. She curated. She passed the mic, not for sound bites, but for justice. Then came a shift. Jasmine turned toward the camera, gaze direct and unwavering. Let's be clear, she said, her voice low and firm. This isn't about cancel culture. It's about consequence. For too long, media giants have played God with the reputations of real people. They twist narratives for profit and walk away while lives fall apart. That ends tonight. She leaned forward slightly, her hand gesturing to her laptop. These stories you've just heard, they weren't mistakes. They were strategy. Her voice darkened. If you're asking why Hannity never corrected the record, you're asking the wrong question. Ask instead why he needed the lie more than he ever needed the truth. Behind her, the screen began rolling clips, side-by-side comparisons. Hannity's segments aired in full. Fiery headlines, ominous music, fast-cutting montages designed to inflame. Next to them, Jasmine showed raw footage, the actual town halls, full speeches, longer quotes from people he had vilified. The contrast was staggering. In one, a school board member was painted as anti-American. In reality, he was reading a Frederick Douglass passage on the meaning of true liberty. Another was a nurse accused of spreading vaccine hysteria. Her real words were about insufficient staffing in rural hospitals. The chat exploded. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was familiar. People didn't just feel manipulated, they felt betrayed. As the live stream surged past 3 million live viewers, Jasmine paused. Then with a quiet finality, she said, Fox won't air these voices, but I will, because truth doesn't expire when it's inconvenient. Then, as if on cue, a new guest joined, Kathy Aru herself, her hair now streaked with silver, her face weary but resolute. She recounted in measured detail how Hannity had once offered $100 to any male staffer who'd take her on a date. A joke, he claimed, but to her it was public humiliation. She spoke not for revenge, but for record. He built a kingdom where mockery was currency, she said, where the value of a woman could be traded for a punchline. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't dramatize. She let Kathy speak uninterrupted for 10 full minutes. The power wasn't in rebuttal, it was in listening. When Kathy finished, Jasmine turned once more to the audience, now topping 5 million. What you've heard tonight isn't political, it's personal. The damage done by deception is not theoretical, it's visible, it's measurable, and it's no longer invisible. She clicked a key on her laptop. A website link appeared on the screen, www.mediavictimregistry.org. This is a resource, and she said, for every name erased, every apology denied, every correction that never aired. Tonight, we begin the archive that Fox News never wanted to exist. The chat slowed for a moment, as if even the viewers needed to take a breath. Then it roared back to life. Donations flooding in, emails offering testimony, volunteers pledging to catalog clips, timestamps, and fact checks. What began as a solo live stream had become a movement, not led by slogans, but by scars. By the second hour, the broadcast had broken records, surpassing even presidential debate numbers on several platforms. Not because of controversy, but because, for once, victims weren't framed. They were centered. Jasmine leaned back in her chair for the first time, exhaling. "I didn't come here to win a debate," she said softly. "I came to make sure no one gets buried under another broadcast again." And as the live stream continued, an endless scroll of testimony, footage, and digital solidarity, one thing became painfully, unmistakably clear. Silence had finally met its match. It came not with thunder, but with a whisper. At exactly 8:03 a.m. East Coast time, a Fox News press release, plain, clinical, and dispassionate, landed in journalists' inboxes across the country. It was only 4 paragraphs long. The headline, "Sean Hannity to take indefinite leave to focus on personal well-being." No fanfare, no farewell, no farewell monologue filled with flag-waving, Constitution-quoting pride. Just silence packaged in corporate speak. For a man who had spent over 2 decades commanding primetime America like a general at war, it was the strangest of exits. Sean Hannity, the juggernaut of right-wing media, the man whose voice once defined nightly political discourse, had gone quiet, and not even his most devout followers could ignore the strange timing. Just days earlier, Jasmine Crockett had stood on a national stage and carved through his mythos like a scalpel through silk. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was consequence. Inside the Fox News headquarters, tension turned to containment. His name was scrubbed from the week's on-air lineup before noon. The promotional banners on their website were quietly replaced. The bright red Hannity block letter marquee that had once lit up the Manhattan skyline like a symbol of ideological supremacy, gone. Not covered, removed. Executives gave no public reasoning, but they didn't need to. America had already seen what Jasmine showed them. A man who didn't just lose an argument, he lost his mask. In conservative circles, there was confusion first, then defiance. Exhaustion was the official excuse. But exhaustion doesn't come overnight. Exhaustion doesn't erase a career's worth of content from rerun slots. Exhaustion doesn't trigger legal consultants to begin scrubbing archives. What the public witnessed wasn't burnout. It was the first visible fracture in a machine that had long operated without brakes, fueled by outrage, repetition, and unchecked influence. Back-channel whispers painted a more damning portrait. Staffers reported that Hannity hadn't set foot in his usual studio in days. Some claimed his office door remained locked from the inside. Others suggested he had tried to record a defiant message, but it was halted by legal advisors worried it could be used as evidence. It wasn't just his show that was being paused. It was his legacy, now stuck in limbo, suspended by legal threats and public scrutiny. For the first time, silence felt louder than his voice. News outlets on both sides of the aisle began dissecting his downfall. MSNBC ran hour-long specials analyzing the cultural shift, how one woman, armed with facts, law, and lived experience, dismantled decades of narrative manipulation. CNN's Don Lemon delivered a chilling monologue. The fall of Hannity isn't just about one man. It's about what happens when the megaphone becomes more important than the message. Even the usually conservative-leaning Wall Street Journal asked a searing question in its Sunday op-ed. Was Sean Hannity ever a journalist, or just the loudest actor in America's longest-running political theater? But perhaps most damning of all were the reactions from inside his own ideological ranks. Viewers who once echoed his every word began questioning the script. Former colleagues went curiously quiet. Some issued half-hearted defenses on Twitter, but the fire was gone. Hannity's defenders looked like soldiers who had just realized they might have followed the wrong general into battle. The once blazing army of loyalists now resembled a retreating crowd, confused and leaderless. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't post celebratory tweets or call press conferences. She stayed absent from television. Instead, her silence became its own form of pressure, letting the weight of truth sit with the country without interruption. She had said what needed to be said. The truth had been televised. Now the echoes did the work. And those echoes grew louder. Clips of her confrontation replayed endlessly online, each rewatch surfacing a new detail. A glance, a pause, a turn of phrase that hit harder with context. Memes flooded social media. The quote, "I'm a lawyer, you're a potential defendant," appeared on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and protest signs. Students in journalism schools began quoting her lines in class debates. On campuses across the country, her words replaced textbook passages. And in this new charged atmosphere, Hannity's absence didn't inspire sympathy. It inspired questions. What else had been hidden? How many others had been silenced? How long had America mistaken charisma for credibility? Inside Fox, internal communications took on a new tone. Producers who once worked tirelessly to construct nightly echo chambers now found themselves asking legal teams what segments could be re-aired without triggering liability. Editors dug through archives, identifying episodes where information might have crossed into provable misinformation. HR initiated a review of every harassment claim made in the past 15 years, including the Kathy Ryu incident, now front and center thanks to Jasmine's laser-point accuracy. And still, Hannity stayed gone. Rumors swirled that he had fled to Florida, staying at a private compound surrounded by family and attorneys. One former Fox staffer anonymously reported, "He's not resting, he's unraveling." Another insider confirmed that several of Hannity's sponsors had pulled contracts overnight, demanding brand distance until investigations wrapped. The man who once boasted of being unbreakable had simply vanished, and yet his absence only amplified Jasmine's presence. It wasn't just a television moment anymore. It was a shift. A woman of color standing alone on a stage designed to humiliate her had turned the tables so completely that the man holding the cards left the game altogether. And America watched it happen in real time. In Washington, members of Congress, quietly at first, began to reference the Hannity reckoning in hallway conversations. Lawmakers debated calling for hearings on media ethics, misinformation, and corporate broadcasting accountability. Lobbyists for media reform saw a sudden boost in funding. Activist groups printed her face next to the phrase, "Not afraid of your cameras, only afraid of silence." But no matter how many headlines it generated, one image remained seared in the public's mind. The look on Hannity's face the moment Jasmine asked if he believed in freedom of speech or freedom to deceive. He had no answer then, and in the days since, none had arrived. So the screen stayed dark. The show didn't air. Hannity's chair sat empty, and for the first time in years, the primetime hour that once reverberated with outrage fell silent. But it wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence after an explosion. When the dust settles, the ears ring, and the world waits to see what's left standing. And what remained was not Hannity. It was Jasmine, still standing, still watching, still waiting. The storm had passed. The headlines had cooled. The camera crews had rolled back their cords and folded their tripods. Fox News was silent. Hannity's name had been wiped from prime time, like chalk washed away by rain. And across the country, a new question echoed. Not just what happened, but what changed. The answer stood quiet in a chair across from Anderson Cooper on a late-night CNN special. There were no roaring audiences, no flashing headlines on the lower third of the screen. Just one camera, one host, and Jasmine Crockett sitting with her hands calmly folded in her lap, eyes locked on the lens. Not for attention, but for clarity. The air around her was unusually still, like the moment before a judge hands down a verdict. Anderson had asked her the question everyone else was too afraid to ask bluntly. "Do you feel vindicated?" She didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't lean forward or back. She just held her breath for half a second, then gave the country its answer. "We don't need to destroy anyone to demand justice," she said slowly, her voice like carved glass. Sharp, clear, deliberate. We only need to cut the microphone of the man screaming with borrowed sound. The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Anderson didn't speak. The producers didn't cue a follow-up. The studio didn't fade to commercial. The line just lingered. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was a nail in a coffin built out of decades of misinformation, intimidation, and performance masquerading as patriotism. That one sentence, less than 20 words, tore through the country's collective spine. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even reacting. She was doing what she'd done from the very beginning, choosing precision over volume. It was a lesson wrapped in restraint, and the weight of that choice didn't go unnoticed. Backstage, a junior CNN staffer stood frozen at the monitor. She wasn't part of the segment. She wasn't even assigned to that floor. But when Jasmine spoke, she found herself transfixed. She would later write a blog post titled, "When Justice Whispered Back," calling that moment the most powerful silence she'd ever witnessed on live TV. It went viral within the hour. And it wasn't just the staffer. All across the country, people paused mid-sentence, mid-scroll, mid-thought, just to replay that one line. On TikTok, creators stitched Jasmine's sentence over footage of civil rights marches, courtrooms, and flashing headlines about Hannity's sudden fall from grace. On Twitter, activists and journalists turned it into a banner. Borrowed microphones have echoes. Truth has roots. But in that studio, Jasmine didn't react to any of that, because she wasn't speaking for a meme. She was speaking for the invisible. The women too afraid to report harassment because the newsroom protected its stars. The men who had been slandered in prime time and never received an apology, only silence. The interns who brought coffee to anchors spreading propaganda. The viewers who never knew they were being taught to distrust each other under the guise of patriotism. Anderson eventually found words again. "Some people say this moment was your triumph," he offered carefully, still shaken. "Would you call it that?" Jasmine shook her head once. "This isn't a moment, it's a wound." Her voice never rose. "And I didn't win anything. The truth just finally stopped being afraid." Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to reroute the program's timeline. The interview had gone off script, far beyond their time cues, but no one dared cut it short. This wasn't content. This was reckoning, and it kept unfolding with every breath Jasmine took. She talked not about herself, but about systems, about silence as a currency in media circles, about careers built not on truth, but on the tolerance of distortion, about the way America treats microphones like badges instead of responsibilities. She spoke not like a victor, but like a surgeon cutting out a tumor, methodical, unsentimental, focused on what must be removed for the body to live. Then she said nothing more. She stood quietly, shook Anderson's hand, and left the studio through a side hallway with no security detail, no press trail, no entourage. Just her phone, and the weight of a nation that had suddenly remembered the difference between freedom of the press and the freedom to manipulate. Across the country, TV pundits scrambled to spin the moment. Some on the far right called her words a veiled threat to free speech. Others, trying to be clever, labeled her the woke whisperer. But those arguments didn't land, not this time. Because Jasmine hadn't shouted, she hadn't canceled, she hadn't demanded vengeance. She had only pulled the curtain back on a system that had protected one voice above all others for too long, and asked the simplest question of all: who gave him the microphone? That question echoed longer than anything Hannity had ever screamed in his career. It made its way into classrooms, into courtrooms, into corporate media boardrooms where new anchors now practice not just what to say, but when to shut up. A journalism professor at New York University printed Jasmine's quote across the top of a syllabus for his ethics class. "This," he told his students, "is the line between commentary and corruption." Meanwhile, Jasmine refused all follow-up interviews. She declined offers from major networks. She rejected book deals and documentary pitches. Her office released a simple statement the next day: "The Congresswoman believes the truth doesn't need a sequel. It needs enforcement." That alone sent chills through newsrooms everywhere. Because in an era where everyone chased the next headline, the next clip, the next applause, Jasmine Crockett walked away without asking for applause. And in doing so, She made every standing ovation look like noise. Even her critics struggled to regain footing. Because how do you attack someone who doesn't claim victory? How do you discredit someone who didn't need to win, only to expose? How do you shout down a woman who already proved silence, when used precisely, can shake the walls of a nation louder than any rant? In private texts, rival pundits admitted to each other, she didn't just win, she rewrote the rules. And yet Jasmine, in her final words, hadn't even asked for new rules. She had simply reminded the country what it means to speak without a borrowed microphone, to speak from truth, to speak with earned volume, not inherited power. And that, in the end, was the line that stayed with America long after the cameras turned off. We only need to cut the microphone of the man screaming with borrowed sound. No threats, no gloating, just the quiet dismantling of a legacy built on noise. And in that quiet, something sacred was reborn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.